So where we left off was choosing a pattern that works for you, and the next part of this video is going to be what to do with it once you have it. So just to review shopping tips, you're going to want to check your size at the top of the fabric quantity chart to make sure that you buy the right amount of fabric. And you want to follow the list of suggested fabrics. This should be on the pattern envelope, but if you still aren't sure, you can even talk to a store employee and they can help you. Read the fabric restrictions and make sure that this fabric fits with your lifestyle and sewing experience. So don't pick a fabric that's going to be too high maintenance if you don't like keep taking care of your clothes. For example, like if you would need to steam it before you wear it and you don't have a steamer or you can't be bothered, you probably don't want to choose that. Also, if you hate ironing, you should pick certain fabrics over other ones that are more wrinkle resistant. Buy all the notions that are listed on the pattern, and it's wise to buy these at the same time that you buy your fabric. So if you're at a store like Fabricland, buy it all at the same time so you have it when you need it. And also buy the thread when you buy the fabric so you can see how they go together. So if you're sewing a navy dress, you're going to want to pick a fabric that looks good with that navy, and you don't want to pick something that's going to show. So once you have your pattern, you're going to open the envelope. Each pattern piece is identified by a name, a number, and a view. You want to pay particular attention to the pattern. If you've ever made a model airplane or done something that's step by step, this is a very similar experience. You want to handle the tissue paper very gently. It rips easily, and if you want to use the pattern again, you're going to have to be even more careful. And you want to make sure that you only cut the pattern pieces you need for the garment that you wish to sew. There's probably going to be different styles and potentially even shirts and skirts on the pattern. So you're going to want to make sure you're only cutting what you need for what the garment that you want, or you're not going to have enough fabric. The first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to cut apart the pattern pieces very carefully. You don't need to use your fabric scissors for these. You're going to want to use just your normal household kitchen scissors or your school supply scissors. And you want to smooth them out with a warm, dry iron to make sure they're not wrinkled. That wrinkle might add a couple millimeters, and that means your whole pattern would be off. So you don't want to put the iron right on the piece. You're going to want to put it sandwich it between a towel or something like that and smooth it out from there. So put the tissue paper in between two towels and then iron them down so they're nice and flat. You're also going to need to determine how many times each piece will need to be cut. So sometimes one shape on the pattern will need to be cut 3 or 4 times. So you're going to want to have a piece of paper or something, so if you're not doing it all in one shot, which I doubt that you are, you want to put your next steps and what you need to do. You're also going to mark the cutting line for your size. You can do this with chalk if you want, but you want to make sure that you're cutting on the right lines for your size. You're probably at the point where you want to start sewing, but at this point, there's still some things that you need to make sure that you have done. This is really important. These are not optional. So no matter how badly you want to sew, you got to do this first. The first step is pre-shrinking, which means you're going to shrink your fabric so it doesn't shrink later. You're going to shrink it in the same way that you plan on using the finished garment. So if I'm making a dress and I'm going to throw it in the wash and then throw it in the dryer, I'm going to want to do that to my fabric. When you purchase the fabric, make sure that you look at the care instructions so you can launder it correctly. And if you're unsure, ask someone at the store what the care instructions are. Once you've shrunk your fabric, you're going to want to straighten the fabric ends. You're going to do this with an iron, and you want to realign the fabric grain. So you're going to want to look at how the fabric is being put together, and you're going to want to make sure that the grain is all aligned. There are videos on how to do this on YouTube, so if you're not feeling comfortable, then that's an idea of something that you could watch really quickly. You can also do this in the Fashion Resource Center. So there's a link there that can help you do this in a more interactive way. Once your pattern pieces are organized and your fabric is prepared to cut, you're ready to lay the pattern on the fabric. But before you can do that, you need to decide which side of the fabric is the right side. So you want to look at both sides of the fabric. Depending on the fabric, sometimes it's really obvious. So if I have a polka dotted fabric, on the other side, it might not be polka dot. So if I want the garment to be polka dot, I'm going to want to mark the right and the wrong side of the garment. It's going to tell you in the instruction which way to put the right side and the wrong side. So that will be important for you to know. So some clues, if you're not quite sure, is, like I mentioned, printed fabrics have a sharper, vivid image on the right side. That's the side that you would actually be looking at if you were wearing the garment. Smoother fabrics are typically softer and shinier on the right side, and they're duller on the wrong side. Textured fabric has more distinctive texture on the fabric face of the right side. And brocades and other fancy fabrics tend to have a smoother, nicer face on the wrong side. So there should be two sides to your fabric, and you want to make sure that you're cutting and selecting your pattern on the right one. The next thing you'll need to do is make a mark. You could actually draw stuff from the pattern right onto your fabric. The easiest way to do this is with chalk. You can see that someone has taken a piece of chalk and just sharpened it with a pencil sharpener, and this gives you a nice fine tip so that you can draw pretty detailed. Depending on how complicated your drawing is, you might want to draw on things like buttonholes, things like darts and tucks. And marking these seam lines can help you, so you know where you need to make all of these marks. So especially if you're inexperienced, you should be marking your stuff. So here are different types of markings, just in case. Ooh, this slide is wrong. So it turns out I didn't finish this slide, but I'm just going to narrate to you what I was going to say, and then I will fix it in the PowerPoint. So one way that you can mark is with dressmakers, carbon paper, and a tracing wheel. So if you're using any really firmly woven fabric, this is a good way to do this because it's quick, easy, and accurate, and the entire stitching line can be transferred to the fabric. That's what that wheel does. It makes the line go across. So you can use a ruler and trace the whole stitch on there if you want. Another way that you can do this is with wax chalk. So wax chalk is is something that we use on wool. It's not easily rubbed off on the fabric, but the problem with wax chalk is if you're using a fabric other than wool, it might leave grease marks on it. So you don't want to use it on anything other than wool. You also need to sharpen the edge to make fine lines, so that can be sometimes tricky because it is a waxy chalk, like I mentioned. You can use washable marker pen, and you can use this on most washable fabrics. It's pretty quick and easy, and the markings will disappear after a couple of washes. The washable marker pen is hard to achieve accuracy if the pens aren't sharp. And you need to remove the markings before you press the garment with an iron so that the pen dye doesn't become permanent. Another thing that you can use is tailor tacks. The problem with tailor tacks is that they sometimes, depending on the fabric, show the puncture marks from the needles. So you'd want to use this on wool or spongy or knit fabrics. The good thing is they can be easily taken out and readjusted. They're visible on both the right and the wrong sides of the fabric. But it is very time consuming to put all those tailor tacks in, and sometimes they need to be removed before the machine stitches, depending on how big the head on them is. Thread tracing is another way that you can tack, and it is this, you just make a line with thread instead of the tailor tacks. So stitching, on to stitching. Regular stitching is usually used to permanently stitch seams, and so usually there's about 10 or 12 stitches per inch, and sometimes you need to use smaller stitch lengths for finer fabrics and longer stitch lengths for heavier fabrics. But if you're just stitching plain old cotton, it's generally 10 to 12 stitches per inch. Sometimes you might want to do a stitching sample with your thread and your fabric before making your garment to make sure that everything looks nice. So if you have some scraps after you've done some cutting, you could just do a quick stitching sample with the leftovers. Regular stitching is also used for stay stitching, directional stitching, or understitching, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And generally the stitching is used to make seams. Seams is the basic unit of any garment, and the seam allowance for a pattern is generally 1.5 centimeters. So this is the distance from where you cut and where you sew. And you're going to want to make sure that you keep that 1.5 centimeters or your pattern is going to be all wonky. They're usually sewn with this regular stitch length like I talked, and then back stitched at the beginning and the end. So if you're stitching in a certain direction, you're going to, like if you're stitching and moving your fabric up, then when you get to the end, you're going to just move it down for a couple stitches and then move it back up to finish it, so the stitching stays put and it stays firm. Plain seams are generally straight, curved, or cornered. And then seam finishes, all seams should be finished if they aren't covered by a lining. So serging is an example of seam finishing. This prevents raveling and contributes to the overall neatness of the garment. But if you don't have a serger, it could be kind of challenging. So when you finish plain seams, you press them open and then finish them. And then if you're finishing curved or cornered seams, they're finished after they're stitched. So once they've been finished, then the seam is clipped and notched and then pressed. So with plain straight seams, you press and then finish, and then with plain or cornered seams, you finish and then press. Standards for evaluating seams, if you're trying to figure out if your seams are great, is you want to make sure they're even for the entire length of the seam. You want to make sure they're the right length. So depending on the pattern, they'll tell you what stitch length is appropriate. You want to make sure that the stitch lies flat, so there's no puckering or pulls, it's not bumpy. You want to make sure it's finished, so it stays where it is, and the width and the type is appropriate. So you've used the right seam for the job, and the seam width is appropriate as well. So in the PowerPoint, I'm going to post, I want you to be clicking on the examples here. They'll help you figure out the different types of stitches, and depending on the pattern, you might need to use some of these, like a gathering stitch. So this is more information that you would need to use depending on the pattern, and you can always look up this information as you're sewing. Supporting fabrics. Facings are made from fabric and then cut. It is cut in the same shape and grain, but applied to the wrong side of the fabric. So it lies between the facing and the garment. And lining can be functional or decorative or both. So lining is joined to the garment, and then the seams go around. So there are certain supporting fabrics like facing and lining that help support the shape of the garment. We are going to talk about pressing, and then we are done. So why would you press a garment after you've created it? You really want to flatten and smooth out the seams after stitching, but also before crossing with other seams. So sometimes two seams might cross over each other. You want to make sure the first one's pressed, so when you go over it with the cross seam, you're going to make sure that it's flat. And you can also use pressing to build shapes. So you could introduce a curved shape by pressing a fabric piece over a curved surface, such as a tailor's ham. So sometimes pressing can help you build the shape that you want. And pressing involves three things: heat, moisture, and pressure. And you would use that with an iron and the steam function, and you lift and push with the iron, not moving it back and forth. So you're really just squishing it with the iron to make sure that it is super, super flat. So those are the basics, and hopefully that gives you enough information to tackle creating your own garment.